Right. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to host Catalyst event, which is a really exciting opportunity to bring experts in machine learning and artificial intelligence and our clinical side community. And so let me just start that I'm an associate director of CTSI, and our mission is to improve rural health by marrying technology and science, basic science with clinical data science. So to enable translation to improve human health. And some of these technologies that are emerging quite recently, I would say, have taken the world by a whirlwind, like machine learning and artificial intelligence. And this technology, I have to say, it's not new at all. I mean, I was growing up in 70s. There were a lot of talk about building neural networks and stuff like that, but usually that field was marginalized because it's actually a mystery to me why, but there was not really super major breakthroughs until literally less than a decade ago, when I think advent of GPU and new algorithms that allowed us to actually advance the field quite far. So what is machine learning? Actually, there is no mystery to that. And in fact, CTSI has tried to organize already a bootcamp to explain, to demystify machine learning. So in a sense, if you think about it, as a clinician, as a scientist, you always look for relationship between observation and some sort of an explanation what it is, right? So if you have some sort of parameters, you try to first do a regression with respect to it, and the next way you can try to create a sort of a different way to explain your observables. And machine learning, in a sense, is doing exactly that. It's just it can detect relationships at much deeper level that at this point our intuition does. So machine beat our intuition in a sense. So whether we can dwell on it and get very upset that the machines are getting better, it's a different topic of conversation. But I think as anything in the life, when you see a progress, you want to embrace it rather than resist it. And machine learning and artificial intelligence is coming our way. Actually, it's full blown, is in our way, and it's only gonna get deeper and more integrated in our lives. So as such, we want to be prepared, and we want to actually utilize all the powers that are coming with that. And those powers they're not only just detecting correlations, but they're also predictive and generative. And those kind of things are quite interesting and amazing to me. Because one thing, when you try to see a data and try to explain it, and you say, okay, I have a relationship, I detected these relationships, is one thing. But another thing is actually to create a new model, and create an idea of what this data is. That's what a new sort of level of machine learning that is coming our ways. And with those models, I can tell you there are already innovations that drive molecular therapeutics, for example, where people design proteins that never existed in nature just by asking machine to imagine. Literally, imagine a protein that will bind to another protein and inactivate it, because that protein is super active in cancer, for example. Imagine that. So, and that possibility is already here. It's just a question of refining it and making it happen. So the possibility of machine learning are enormous. And with that, we wanted to actually promote it at Penn State and make it actually one of the institutions that pushes it forward more than just being trailing back and being reactive to it. So with that, we actually have an amazing team. Actually, UP especially has a huge cluster of people who are world-leading experts in machine learning. And Wasan is our representative, and he basically is leading this effort, not only at UP, but at the whole Penn State. And with that, I'm really humbled to have this event happen, especially because of Vasant and Avnish and Tyler, who helped as well. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikolai. So I'm just a representative. There's a lot of people that are doing machine learning at Penn State. So first, a few words of thanks to Jennifer and Nikolai for making this event happen. The Penn State CTSI staff, some of whom are here, Tyler and Avnish, and of course our fearless informatics team that is part of the Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, Justin Petrucci, who will be speaking later, Daniel, which was sitting over there, and a number of students that I didn't fit on the slide. Right, so the informatics core, just to give you an idea, is focused on the informatics infrastructure to support clinical research. And part of it, today's focus is going to be primarily on electronic health records data. Right, there are lots of different areas where you could use machine learning, but today's focus is going to be on clinical data, and particularly on how to facilitate multi-institutional collaborations, and of course, applying machine learning to this data. Now, when we started out, at least when I first came in contact with this general area here at Penn State, the situation was that we couldn't get access to clinical data, right? So before you can do anything with it, you couldn't even get at it. And every data request would take months, sometimes years. And so if it's too hard to do something, try something, people walk away and do something else, right? Because you're not going to sit around. So part of this was to create some infrastructure so we could play in this arena. And that's what the CTSI Informatics Core has been doing for quite some time. And so we'll tell you a little bit about that. And then, so this is the rest of the core, number of students here. So our vision has been to get Penn State electronic health records data ready for this world of AI and ML. So if you want to use machine learning, if you want to solve some problems of interest from a clinical perspective, so for example, predicting the risk of some disease, early, or identifying which interventions are more effective than others based on this large clinical data sets. First, you have to have the data in some form that's usable. And then you need the algorithms to apply. Then these data sets, in order for these studies to be meaningful, have to be very large. They have to be representative, millions of patients. And most individual institutions don't have that kind of data, particularly for rare diseases and so on, which means you actually need a network of multiple institutions to contribute their data, right? So this is the setup that we're interested in. And the last part of today's effort is to sort of lower the barrier for these collaborations to happen across the campuses. Right, so there are a number of people from UP that are here. Sounder is sitting over there. Some students are there, and they'll be available later on to speak with folks that are interested. And so just to kind of set the stage, right? So there is artificial intelligence and machine learning. These terms are interchangeably used. They don't necessarily always mean the same thing, right? So just for the purpose of today's discussion, there are many different roles of AI. And for today's discussion, it's primarily about augmenting and extending human intelligence. Right? It's not necessarily about automation of something that people do, but to help people do what they do better, right? And machine learning, Nikolai already sort of gave an introduction, essentially is about replacing humans writing code with machines that are trained on large data sets and to perform tasks that maybe we don't quite understand how to do. We are good at doing the task, but we're not quite so good at explaining how it is to be done. So I can't write a program on how to do cancer diagnosis, but I can look at a large database of pre-diagnosed cases and learn some patterns from it, right? So that's essentially what machine learning is about. And so this is one type of machine learning. So you have input X, in this case, might be a patient record. Output Y might be a diagnosis that happened at some point in time. And you want to learn a mapping from input, the patient record, to the diagnosis and using a large data set of historical records of patients and diagnosis. Okay, so this is how it would work. So you have this unknown mapping from patients' records to diagnosis. You have some learning algorithm that takes that data and spits out some approximation of the reality. It's always an approximation. The question is, how good an approximation is it? Is the data biased? All of those questions. So this is already happening. This made it to New York Times back now 5 years ago, and basically the thesis there was that radiology, you can get machines to do the work that is done by radiologists reasonably well, right? And this is happening in many other areas. So this is another example, lung cancer diagnosis. This made quite a splash when it first came out. Essentially, by looking at images of the retina, you can diagnose diseases that have nothing to do with the eye, right? Amazing. Okay. And we wouldn't know unless we actually looked at large data sets where the set things are possible. Okay. So the applications obviously go across all of these areas of medicine. So if you look at the current state of AI in healthcare, so on the one hand, I want to get you all excited about machine learning, particularly the clinical researchers here. So you want to do it. At the same time, I don't want to overhype this because there is that as well in our field. Right? So these techniques are still, despite much progress, are still in their infancy. So we don't understand, for example, how some of these models actually work, particularly the more complicated ones. There's issues with bias in the data and so on. So there's much work to be done. But early results show that if you have a top expert, a physician, on one hand, and an AI system on the other, right? The AI system may not necessarily always beat the best expert at the game. However, if you put them together, you can do better than either one of them could do. That's really the value proposition here. It's not to replace the physician. Particularly, you don't want to trust a black box that came up with the prediction that's not viable. However, it could be a physician assistant, a very good physician assistant that would occasionally make predictions that may be different from a physician's, and then ask the expert to take a second look, right? So, okay, and so we worked on a number of these kinds of problems in the past, but I'll skip that. Here is one concrete project, which is something that Justin Petrucci and others here, Dr. Aziz and his group were involved in. So the high level, this problem is a bit like this, and this is prototypical of many of the problems that you can solve using this large clinical electronic health records data. So particularly this type of data is by itself quite challenging. So it's not that you can just, in its full generality, you can't just take an off-the-shelf machine learning algorithm and apply it, and I'll point out why. Okay, so this is a sort of a cartoon of electronic health records data. So there's different patients, and each one of these triangles represents a visit or some procedure that was done. And they don't happen at regular time intervals. So this is not like a time series. So this happens, you show up at the hospital whenever you have a problem. So there's arbitrary gaps between these measurements. And on any given visit, there are probably thousands of things that could be measured about this patient, but only a handful of them are measured, right? Whatever was done, whatever was recorded on that visit. And the data that is missing cannot be easily imputed. It's not missing at random. So for example, if the physician didn't do a COVID test, that probably means there was no reason to. It doesn't mean that you can just sort of impute that data statistically from all the other data. So these characteristics particularly make this data very challenging. So if you have this sort of historical data, and then there's also the question of what the reference time point is, because you can't align patients based on the age, physiological age, and so on. So you have to sort of think about when to align, and typically it's done based on some particular prediction that you want to make. So if you're trying to predict outcomes in a 30-day window after COVID diagnosis, that becomes the reference point, and everything before that becomes in history. Okay. So, so here you can do simple things like you can aggregate all of this history into some sort of summary and then try to do a prediction. You can actually look at the full history and try to do the prediction, which is more complicated. You can also look at how some particular risk is changing over time. So, for example, how is the individual's risk about let's say heart disease changing over time? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing as you sort of slide this window back and forth? Right? So lots of different types of things you can do. Okay, so in this particular case, some simple machine learning techniques actually were able to do quite well. So this would be the chance prediction. You can do way better than chance. Of course, you would like to be there if you had perfect prediction, but in many of these problems, perfect prediction is not. Right, so, and then you can do more. This is mostly Justin's work here. So you can look at the importance of these different variables in terms of the contribution to prediction. You can identify the most predictive variables for a clinician to then go and look at, then try to see whether that makes sense, and so on. Right? So we want to be able to do these kinds of studies, and we don't want this huge burden in terms of making a data request, waiting for 6 months to get the data. And if you wanted to do a multi-site study, there's simply no way because you can't ship the data to other places, and so on. Right, so that was our goal. And so we set out to create some infrastructure as part of the CTSI informatics core. So the idea is that you create a data repository that has a standardized format so that, and Justin is going to say more about this. We adopted the common data model that was created by a consortium of medical institutions led by Columbia. It's a huge NIH-funded project, multi-year effort. So that standardized the terminology for describing medical procedures, medications, diagnosis scores, and so on. So everything is in some standardized vocabulary, regardless of which particular EHR system that data is extracted from. So this is not the operational EHR system. It's the data that is extracted from the EHR in this standardized format. And then there's, on top of it, you want to have machine learning algorithms that can operate on the data or do other statistical analysis and so on. And then eventually you want to be able to link this data to other data that's patient related. So why is this important? So for example, if you know where patients live, you might be able to get some fairly coarse measures of socio-demographic variables in that location. And that may tell you something about social vulnerability of those patients, look at health disparities and so on. You could also look at environmental exposures. We had a small NSF project a few years back with Pittsburgh and Harvard that did a pilot on this. So it's linking clinical data with socio-demographic and environmental data based on location and then de-identifying the whole data set. And then you can do that. But more importantly, we want to be able to do these multi-site studies. I told you why that's important. Any single site most likely doesn't have the patient population to really study the condition that you want to study. It's challenging to share electronic health records data across institutions. So NIH has created this, all of us project, and that might at some point make it possible. But this is a low barrier way of doing that. And the basic idea is that all of the data, clinical data at these different institutions stays there. So if everybody has their particular data repository, the data stays there. You go to this consortium and say, I want to do this multi-site study. I'm interested in the study of, cardiovascular disease risk based on clinical history. And I want to study a population with certain demographics, some age group. So this is my cohort. Here's the study protocol. I go to the consortium and ask, who else is interested in this? Okay, let's say 10 institutions volunteer. in a basically almost, it's not that trivial because sometimes you have to adjust the code a little bit, but basically in a matter of hours, you can spin up a multi-site study. Okay. Within days, you can get your first results. Okay. So that's what's possible with this setup. So we have been working on it for quite some time now. It's going from test to production, and that's why we decided to have this event at this time. Okay, so right. So that's a map of all the locations around the world that have this particular common data model. That's hundreds of them, right? And of course, not everybody necessarily wants to participate in a study, but that's the pool from which you can draw. And so they have also established some data quality standards, so we can run that on our data and so figure out how we compare with other places. Basically, I already went over this. So this is possible. And so I also talked about, and this is really the future. We've done a very small pilot earlier with working with Pittsburgh and Harvard on a project like this. But the idea is take the electronic health records data, and then either based on some identifier, link it to other data. So this graphic is from Chirag Patel. So it essentially shows that for a majority of chronic health conditions, the genetic or the component explains about 30% of the variability. And the rest is everything else, the environmental and social demographic and so on. So if you really want to understand health, you probably want to connect the clinical data with other data to really understand. Yeah. So that's just a few examples of that. Right. So this is the setup, and this is not just infrastructure. We also can bring to this innovative methods. So, for example, this longitudinal data, I mentioned some of the challenges. We have a separate NSF-funded project that is essentially developing algorithms that can address each one of those complications that I mentioned. The irregular measurement intervals, extreme sparsity, high dimensionality. So we have algorithms, a series of algorithms that address those challenges. And those were motivated primarily by looking at health data. So when we figured out that you need those, we developed those. We can also do federated learning. So the idea here is similar to the Odyssey idea, where the data sets are distributed, and the learning algorithm sends queries to those data sets for statistical summaries. You can put the model together without ever sharing. And then Nikolai mentioned causality. That's extremely important, particularly in healthcare settings, right? So it's one thing to tell somebody that they have an elevated risk of heart disease. It's something else to be able to tell that individual what they can do to change that, right? Correlation is not causation. We all know that, right? Here's a funny, which one? Yeah, so this is a plot of science funding in the United States correlated with deaths by suicide and hanging. Suicide by hanging. So given one, I can almost perfectly predict the other. Okay. Give this data to the senator from Oklahoma who hires some interns to find out all the waste, fraud, and abuse in federal funding. They would have a field day, right? If correlation with causation. Okay, but now there are methods for sort of teasing apart correlation and causation. It's more complicated. There are machine learning methods that allow us to do that. Here's, I don't have the time to go into details, maybe a topic for a future one. We even have methods where a study has been done, a controlled study, like a randomized controlled trial has been done in one location, let's say Los Angeles. You don't know whether the finding works in Chicago because maybe the demographics is different. You don't have the budget to do a controlled study in Chicago. The question is, can you take the study from Los Angeles and just some observations, not a controlled study, but just some observational data from Chicago, and figure out whether the finding from Los Angeles ports over to Chicago. There are methods now that are available to do that. So in many cases, it turns out using more advanced causal analysis, we can even answer causal questions without running a randomized trial in many cases. Not always. There are cases where randomized trials are absolutely necessary, but there are situations where you can avoid a randomized trial. Okay, so this is not well known, not very well known. So maybe it's something to think about when you're thinking about a randomized trial. Okay. So, and there are many other things. So what next? So today what we wanted to do was to bring together a few people with ideas for research projects, with others like Justin and Sundar and others, to essentially build those collaborations. So the way we have set up is we had a call for abstracts are submitted, and so they're going to give short talks. Before that, Justin will give a little more detail about this common data model and sort of give a demonstration of how that works. And then based on these abstract presentations, we will have some time for just casual discussions. And so that, and then there will be a pilot funding announcement that will follow from CTSI so that new collaborations can begin. Okay. Of course, that's not, you don't necessarily have to apply for CTSI pilot funding to begin a collaboration, but that's just a mechanism if people need that, right? So that's all I have to say. Thank you, and then over to Justin.
I'm just gonna try to screen share these from Zoom. So, so you're good. What's that? Stop this. Stop.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Justin Tucci, and as mentioned, I'm a member of the CTSI Informatics Board. My formal appointment with Penn State is at the Institute for Computational Data Sciences. My background's sort of in computational physics, sort of used to model absorption of different gases on carbon nanostructure materials and sort of different types of surface physics. But for the last few years, I've been working with Dr. Honavar and Avnish on various EHR-based projects that utilize machine learning. And today I'm going to talk about how Odyssey and OMOP sort of fit into that piece, and talk about some of these network studies, and we'll see one of those in action. I have my slides here at this link, but I'm sure we could send that out after this as well. So a little motivation, but I think sort of this has been given, right? Across disciplines, across domains, right? There's a data explosion, there's lots of data available, and that data has the promise of potentially being useful or perhaps transformative in terms of like the information it contains. But there's a lot of challenges, particularly in healthcare, and sort of bringing that to fruition. Dr. Honavar talked about data access issues. And, I would say sort of, I wasn't part of the group during those initial sort of challenges with the more tabular healthcare data. I think now it's in a pretty good place in terms of getting access to large tabular health data, whether that's from Penn State or we have some data vendors with TriNetX and now, as we'll see, being a member of the Odyssey Collaborative. But getting access to other sort of modes of data, image data, ECG data can still be a challenge, getting that in sufficient quantity and quality. Once you get the data, right, you need expertise in how to sort of wrangle that and transform that into, you know, a usable data structure that you can ingest into downstream analytic pipelines. So you need that expertise. You need expertise in those methods that Dr. Honavar was mentioning. Some of these data sets are huge, tens to hundreds of terabytes. So now you need sort of the know-how to sort of deal with that sort of size of data. You're not going to run that on a commodity laptop. So now we're talking about different systems you're going to run with, building software stacks. It's a lot of sort of know-how and maybe too much for a single sort of person or a single group. And that's another challenge. Outside of that, just sort of generalizability in the field across different publications, right? A publication comes out using a data set from some healthcare organization. You're not going to get access to that data set, and that data could be sort of confined to a geographical region that, you know, isn't representative of the population as a whole. So, and in terms of reproducibility, right, healthcare data just generally isn't something that's easily shareable. So that's something that persists. So with CTSI informatics core, trying to address some of these challenges, I mentioned sort of tabular data. I think there's a pretty decent check mark next to that, but we're really trying to sort of hit these other areas and bring that expertise to clinician researchers here. And we're going to see sort of how Odyssey and the OMOP common data model can assist with that. So goals here for my talk, just become familiar with what Odyssey is, high level understanding of the OMOP common data model and some of the tools available from that collaborative. We're going to see one of these patient level prediction network studies, and then sort of where to go from here in terms of engaging from with the informatics core. And we'll have some continuing conversations as well. So Odyssey, it's pronounced Odyssey, Operational Health Data Sciences and Informatics. So who is it? So now it's a global, so we saw the map and we'll see a different map here. It's a global, multidiscipline, multi-stakeholder collaborative. So there's representation from government, industry, academia, and broadly, the goal is to bring out the value in healthcare data and generate sort of evidence sort of around that. So how do they do that? So really, the heart of Odyssey is their common data model. And as mentioned, and we'll dive into not too deep, but sort of just try to get a general understanding, is sort of standardizing across different sites to make that multi-site collaboration much more accessible and easy. As part of that, they have standard way to sort of map different medical concepts into a vocabulary that everyone can agree upon. And finally, there's efforts now underway to standardize different phenotypes for different sort of medical conditions, right? If we say someone has diabetes, what does that mean in terms of like their medical history? What codes does that patient need to have, and sort of what time succession? Maybe it's a series of diagnosis codes, medical labs. So they're building a library of phenotypes as well. So this is the most up-to-date sort of stats I can find from Odyssey. I think this was from the symposium, yearly symposium back in October. You can see sort of just how large this is in terms of like the number of participating individuals, you know, close to 4,000, and really like the biggest thing to show here is they have data on 12% of the world population. So, you know, if you want to run a network study, I'm not saying you're going to get every site participating on that study, but you're going to do a lot better than just your site. So, as mentioned, here at Penn State, there's been a sort of multi-year effort to join this collaborative officially as a data partner. So now sort of we're a dot on this map whenever they update it, and this is sort of like the launch party for that. Now that we have our own production instance of OMOP. So at a high level, as mentioned, the model is have all these sites format their data the same in an agreed upon way, and as sort of defined by the Odyssey Collaborative, and then running a network study is theoretically as simple as sharing an analysis protocol. And in addition to the standard common data model, there's also a lot of tooling and software that Odyssey builds to sort of regularize these different analytic pipelines, whether you want to do patient level prediction or just cohort characterization or even population level effect estimations. They have a suite of tools, suite of software to make that easier when you're operating on their data that's formatted according to their standard. And of course, there's ways to customize that and be as rigorous as you can with different quality and validation checks as well. So OMOP, Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, Common Data Model, OMOP CDM. So again, at a high level, this is just an agreed upon standard way to format the identified healthcare data. So it's one model that can accommodate many different sources, primarily tabular data. So I'm talking like diagnosis codes, procedure codes, lab values, medication sort of history, those sorts of things, but it's built in a way to be flexible. They're already building physician notes, right? That's part of the standard now. And there's, as part of the Odyssey Collaboratives, there's many working groups, and there's a working group dedicated to making image data part of the standard. And generative AI was mentioned as well, and there's a working group sort of talking and thinking about how to sort of incorporate that into the common data model, or at least the tooling within our. So this is sort of your high level view of OMOP CDM version 4.5, which is the version that we're on. And sort of at high level, we have our standardized clinical data. So we have our procedures, our diagnosis table, encounter table, which sort of every time a patient would enter the health system, it's tagged with a sort of encounter code and date, the standardized vocabulary, which we'll talk about, and so on and so forth. Not all of these tables aren't required, right? I think in ours in particular, we're not going to get cost information, but some sites have that. Some sites have more or less location data available, but pretty much required would be the standard clinical data, vocabs, and things like that. And I mentioned it's extensible. Dr. Hanavar and other people are very interested in pulling in geographic sort of data, whether that's zip code based, and this can be extended to incorporate that data or joined later down in some pipeline as well. So what do these tables look like in terms of their columns and rows? And this is sort of just a generic domain table, domain sort of aligning with either procedure tables or lab values or diagnosis codes. So they're patient centric. So each row of the tables corresponds to a given patient. There's going to be a unique identifier for each domain entry. So if this was for procedures, right? Anytime a patient had a procedure, that would have a unique identifying code. This idea of a standard concept from the OMOP vocabulary. So if someone is diagnosed with diabetes, somewhere in the source data that data is transformed into the OMOP common data model, right? That's going to be coded as maybe an ICD-10 code or something like that. But using the OMOP CDM vocabulary, everyone agrees upon sort of how that comes in as a standard concept. So that'll be part of the table and different timing information as well. So this vocabulary that I mentioned, it's quite extensive and a massive undertaking and effort by itself. If you sort of messed around with different coding systems or mess with electronic health data at all, sort of at first and coming from physics, I was, needed to get oriented a little bit with these different coding systems. This graphic on the left, this sort of shows the different coding systems that are out there for these different domains, medication, observation, things like that. So this is really that agreed upon standard that is curated and maintained and part of the OMOP common data model. And sort of just an example of that for AFib, right? There's different coding systems. So AFib could come in, and this is a bit dated now, but as an ICD-9 code as 427.31. It can also come in as a SNOMED code, and then sort of the Odyssey Collaborative sort of standardizes on usually SNOMED as the standard concept for AFib. So if you're running a study and you want to qualify patients for AFib, you would be looking for this standard concept ID of 313.327. I'm not saying that's the best phenotype for AFib. I'm just saying, that's probably going to be part of that phenotype in some way. Okay. So moving quickly here, just again, trying to just hit on high level sort of concepts here. Focusing in on some of the tools from the Odyssey Collaborative, and if we have time, I can sort of show you what this looks like on the web. Athena is essentially a website where you can go and play around and investigate and query this vocabulary. So if you're trying to develop a phenotype or just trying to understand how could you qualify a patient for a given cohort or a given outcome, you can come here and search for standard concepts, and that's exactly what I did here. You can see AFib is sort of still this SNOMED code, and there's information about when this concept became standard and when it expires and things like that. It's very useful sort of to understand that mapping, maybe from the source system to how that maps onto reality in the Odyssey world. Atlas is another tool, and I should mention the tools I'm talking about are really sort of focused on the user side. There's tooling sort of on the other side of setting up an OMOP instance and how to translate that data, do the ETL from the source data to ultimately sort of ingest it into your OMOP instance. I'm sort of focusing on the other side of that. So Atlas being, I guess, your one-stop shop for interfacing with really all of the Odyssey-based tools. You can build cohorts, you can run different characterization studies and patient-level prediction studies. A lot of the analytics you can do with Atlas, though, it's pretty canned, and there's some limits to sort of what's baked into the interface. Sometimes, if you want some level of customization, you have to, drop down into writing the code or modifying the code yourself. But Atlas is useful in that sense because you can develop a high level analysis and then click a button and export the code, and that's the way that these network studies used to be sort of developed. Get started in Atlas, get sort of some code that's close enough, and then sort of customize and then share that with the community. And I'm going to talk about sort of how that's changing when I go over my example. So Hades, sticking with the Greek sort of mythology here, god of the underworld. This suite of so Hades is a suite of packages, and it's really sort of the workhorse here. These are all the packages that sort of formalize those different analytic pipelines. There's packages for how to build a cohort and qualify patients and do those patient level prediction problems, or population level estimation, or even sort of just basic characterization. These can be customized, and everything's open source within Odyssey. Most of the software is in R, which, being a Python guy, I usually sometimes borrow what I can, but then move over to Python. But yeah, lots of available tooling. Okay, so now focusing on a particular network study, and just to sort of refresh here, what do we mean by a network study? So Odyssey, there's many sites that have their data formatted according to the standard, and Odyssey is in the process of formalizing that network of sites into what they call the data network. And you can see on this slide, each row sort of indicates a data partner. They've already gone through this process of taking their source data, doing some sort of ETL, and ultimately getting out a properly formatted common data model database. There's standard checks and validation tools that you can run on that data. And then ultimately, the process would be to develop a analysis protocol. And that can be done sort of at a single site, or open that sort of protocol development stage open to the community as well. The community has tooling to sort of, in Atlas, you can build a basic sort of analytic pipeline and export a sort of template protocol based on sort of what you do there. So you define an analysis protocol, you share that protocol with the community. The community, whoever across this network of data partners runs your study, sort of sends back aggregate results, and that is investigated, combined, and ultimately potentially disseminated as evidence. So this particular study that we're going to focus in on is this patient level prediction problem, and within Odyssey, these patient level prediction problems are formulated as we see here in this graphic. So we have some target population, which we'll call T. For this population, we want to predict which patients at some defined moment of time, known as the index date, will experience some outcome during some time of risk. And so we have the index date at T equals 0. This could be, maybe we want to look at the concept of seizures after stroke. So the index event would be whenever these patients have a stroke event. We'd be looking at, maybe want to look at the time at risk as 30 days. So we want to look at the outcome of seizure after stroke. So that would be our time at risk. And the important thing here is we don't use any information sort of after this index event, right? We don't want to use future information to predict the future. That's an easier task, and not at all useful. So this is sort of the high level formulation of these patient level prediction problems, and in particular, the one that we're going to see here. So this is the initial clinical question for this network study. And this network study that we're going to look at is, I think it kicked off long ago in 2019, but I think it serves as a good template for what these studies look like. And it's been updated recently to use the latest tooling within the community. It uses a package called Strategist, which is where the community is going in terms of coordinating these larger network studies. So the question is, amongst women aged 40 to 47 who undergo screening mammography and who do not have prior breast cancer, which patients will go on to develop breast cancer in the 90 days to 3 years following the screening. Okay, so if we look at our, so come back to our diagram and sort of customize this for this particular problem. Our index date is that first screening of mammography in 2 years. So we require a gap of 2 years. And we don't want any history of breast cancer at any time in the past, or sort of this 90-day buffer. And that 90-day buffer, I believe, was built into the protocol to prevent these sort of cases that were probably there and missed sort of whenever their mammogram was conducted. We're interested in the outcome of breast cancer during this time of this time at risk from 90 days to 3 years. And also this study is requiring at least 3 years of medical history prior to the event of the screening mammogram. So this is the formulation of the clinical question. Essentially, this is sort of getting at what's the risk of breast cancer in between like the sort of established standard of care practice in terms of mammography screening, things like that. So what do we need to, it looks like this blocking the slides, titles. So what do we need in terms of like, what do we actually need to run this study in terms of Odyssey tolling or outside of Odyssey? Well, we need to know how to qualify the patients for the index event. So how do we qualify a patient for a screening mammography? How do we qualify patients for the outcomes? Outcome being breast cancer. What features or covariates should be used to train a model, right? We potentially have, their entire medical history. If this person was within the same health system for their whole life, we have potentially a lot of data on them across a lot of tables in that common data model. How should those features be handled? As Dr. Hanovar said, there's probably going to need some imputation or sort of at least some assumptions there. Should we consider features, the temporal natures of features, or sort of just collapse them down in some aggregate way? What models should be used? How should they be trained and evaluated? These are all things that you need to sort of work through and understand and agree upon before you can actually conduct the study. So within Odyssey, these network studies require a study protocol, and the components are exactly sort of as I mentioned there. And this is something, as a site leading a network study, just sort of not participating in as a lead of a study, but just sort of participating in studies that were conducted elsewhere. It seems like it's maybe 50-50. Some sites sort of wholly develop the protocol themselves and then sort of disseminate that and ask for data partners. Other sites sort of open up the study at the sort of conception stage and welcome insight and collaborations into the development of that protocol. Okay, so now I really want to show like what the study looks like in terms of take a quick look at the protocol. We'll look at the GitHub repository, and then we'll look at some of the results. And I should say, here. So let's go ahead. I'm going to stop on the slides and bring up the. Let me zoom in a little bit. So as I mentioned, this is 2019. It's an older study, but and you maybe saw the name Wu, Women of Odyssey Wu. I think it serves as a good example case. And you can see it's sort of it's a pretty extensive and exhaustive description of what this study looks like with this executive summary. And I just sort of want to focus in on really the building of these cohorts. So these are those intricate details that I was mentioning, right? Information about sort of what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the different cohorts. You see here, they're actually restricting even further that which wasn't mentioned on this slide, different drug exposures that exclude patients from the cohort, et cetera, et cetera. And this protocol is available in the link that I shared. It should take you to a Google Drive directory. So I think this is a good example of you know, what would ultimately be expected for a analysis protocol to participate for us to lead a study. And yeah, feel free to check this out, and we can sort of, I don't want to waste time sort of going through the details of it, but just sort of want to show it at a high level. So now I want to show the GitHub. Okay, so the way that these studies are ultimately disseminated to data network partners is they're thrown on in a repo on GitHub under Odyssey Studies. And it used to be that each study corresponded to like an R package. So this breast cancer between screen would be an R package, and this R package would depend on a lot of those Hades packages that we showed in terms of if this is a patient level prediction problem. So it would use the data connector, it would use the cohort builder, it would use the patient level prediction package. And again, you can customize and tweak any step along the way. But now the sort of the community is changing to sort of simplify things. So while in theory that sounds very simple, right? Everyone's data is the same. We share our package. You install the R package, hit go, and you're sort of off to hit go after you define, what's the host name on my database, what are my access credentials, those sorts of things. But there's issues around sort of building that software environment. There's issues with different backends. While everyone agrees upon the database structure, you have different backends. We have an Oracle backend. There's Postgres. There's a MySQL. There's different backends that you can have, and sometimes the study sort of doesn't work with a particular backends. So the community is changing to this project called Strategist, and the idea is all those analytic pipelines are sort of baked into the Strategist package, and to run a network study, all you need to share is a JSON file. So everyone sort of has the common data model, has their data in the agreed upon structure. They install this Strategist package, which is standard and supported, unlike these sort of one-off study packages, which, depending on the different group or, where this was developed, may not adhere to the sort of proper sort of coding standards and things like that. So Strategist is sort of an Odyssey developed package. So it sort of has that level of rigor in it, and you share a JSON file. So this JSON file, it's just a configuration file, which sort of contains everything you need to sort of as input to all those analytic packages. So how do you qualify patients for the cohort of interest and the outcome? All those concept IDs and all those temporal sort of settings are part of the JSON file. So we can show. So for example, this is just looking at the JSON file for this breast cancer screening study. And you can see, so cohort definitions, it actually has two cohorts. One was sort of breast cancer, no prior breast cancer. The other one was just looking at either benign or malignant neoplasms. but you can see sort of the cohort definition is this sort of abomination of codes, but sort of in here, you can sort of, if I would format this better, right, here's a concept ID, and this JSON file is actually automatically created by the strategist package. So if you're developing this protocol or this strategist JSON file, you launch strategist, you input all these different qualifiers for your cohort, and you sort of click a button and say export this JSON. And running a study is theoretically as simple as that. So back to the study. So with this package, the strategist package, this is all the larger a study really is. You know, a couple lines of R, and really at this level, all you would need to do is change how to connect to your database, and hit go, and it just works. So this is in my opinion, a big advancement, having sort of struggled a little bit with participating in some studies around sort of the way that they used to be disseminated to the community. So the final item I wanted to share is some of the results. So I ran this study on our site actually last night. We're not part of this list of results yet, and maybe you can't see it, but with patient level prediction, you get a whole host of outputs. And of course, you get some high levels metrics of how your model performed. So in each one of these rows is a summary. Maybe I can zoom in here a little bit. Each one of these rows corresponds to another network partner. So this top one I'm looking at was for this analysis 1001 data partner. You see the size of the target cohort and the outcome cohort. So you have an incidence rate, and then you get a AUC value. So different metrics. If we can sort this to see sort of what was the best performance of a model across the data network partners. It looks like 0.68 was the best AUC. You can further drop down and sort of look at other metrics like sensitivity, specificity, et cetera, et cetera. You can modify thresholds and those sorts of things. So I still have the term. So what does this look like for, oh, I got kicked out. Let's see. So there's a few ways to interact with these in these network studies. I primarily use the command line interface and sort of launch our scripts that way. Of course, the community, a lot of people in the community sort of use RStudio, and as I mentioned, it's primarily like in our community, but there are initiatives to incorporate some functionality, port some things over to Python. The patient level prediction package has some deep learning aspects, and a lot of times, if you look at code, they're just calling Python or something else. So I think. So this is the results for our study. Again, I don't have it in a great, nice R Shiny app yet, but just in terms of, so I mentioned there are two cohorts. So let's focus in on just the first cohort. You see some general output for test and train splits. You see the AUROC 0.53, so not so great for our data set, but at the same time, we don't have a lot of data. In the test set, we only had 15 patients qualified for the outcome of interest. And then in our training, we only had 48. So pretty small N here. And then for the second cohort, so the first cohort being no pre-existing neoplasms, second no pre-existing breast cancer, slightly bigger outcome cohort, but again, coin flip prediction. But yeah, so running this study is as simple as let's see here, kicking off an R script, really. I'm on a different system, so but at a high level, that's the results of this patient level prediction study. What do we get out of that? We get out of trained models, which we can compare across different data network partners. We can see if there's consistency across these data network partners, which have different pools of patients. Is there consistency of performance? Are there consistency in terms of the features that are predictive? There's a lot of sort of downstream that you can do once sort of you see these aggregate results from these data network partners. So in terms of next steps, as mentioned, this is sort of like the launch party for the OMOP common data model here at Penn State. We're very interested in leading one of these network studies, and we can certainly help with sort of the analytic pipeline portion. But we don't know the at least I don't know. I can't speak for everyone. I have no clinical background. If I'm the one defining clinical questions, we're probably all in trouble. I'm more on the data side, so we can help inform on sort of the analytic side. If the clinicians here can help sort of define that clinical question of interest in a way sort of analogous to what we saw here in this network study. So developing that clear clinical question, investigate how to qualify patients for the cohorts and outcomes of interest. You can take a look at this phenotype library, which is again within Odyssey. So it'll give standard concept groupings for how to qualify patients. Again, Athena is another place we can go to try to qualify patients, and what features should be used. So there, right now, what do we have access to? Again, it's tabular data for the most part. So we're talking diagnosis codes, procedure codes, lab values, vital signs, those sorts of things. We are developing a formal intake form for engaging with us, but for now, Avnish would be your point of contact, outside of the setting. So with that, thanks for your time, and have some different contact emails, different members of the group, and I borrowed a lot from the Odyssey community for this presentation, so I just want to acknowledge that. Okay. Thanks. Yes.
I just had one question. So I've been using TriNetX to look at patients' risk for developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Okay.
So is the difference between TriNetX and this that you can, is it in here that you can, in that interface that you can use these machine learning models?
So with Atlas, so Atlas being the interface.
With TriNetX, they seem pretty similar. TriNetX also has the common data model. It has different networks that you can pull from. But then I think with this one, from what it looks like, you can run different machine learning models within the interface, where TriNetX, I think, has a few basic functions right now, but it's not as developed.
Yeah, so let me take a shot at that, right? So I mean that's important. What you pointed out is important, but the more fundamental difference is the following. Because of the nature of the agreement that the different data providers have with TriNetX, when they share data with you, they cannot identify where the data is coming from. Okay, so it's just a pool data. Whereas here, when you run a multi-site study, you know where the data is coming from. So you can dig a little bit deeper. Which is not possible. So I mean, these are very complementary. So if I want to just look at a large patient cohort and do some quick analysis, TriNetX is great. If you want to sort of look at something deeper, so for example, if you want to do merge the, patient data with something else, or if you want to say, well, why is this cohort from a New York hospital different from one in central Pennsylvania? Why are the risk factors different? Those kinds of questions you can't really ask, from Translational.
Translational has zip code data, right?
Yes. but
Claims,
not
3-digit, right?
the 3-digit zip codes. I mean, they can't tell you which hospital system that data came.
And then you have to move the data to ICDS or, Hershey, HBC. You don't need to, so on top of what Justin was saying, RStudio, all the infrastructure, the script he was showing, that is internal. So you don't need to extract the data, you don't need to move the data, all the software tools, whatever you need are internal.
Yeah, I
So you
mean,
do
but
your
that's,
analysis here.
yeah, but that's just a convenience speech, but really I think both are complementary. I want to not discourage people from using Trinetics. Here we wanted to talk about Odyssey. But Trinetics is also something that we support as part of the informatics core analysis. But for if you want to run truly a multi-site study where you know what the study partners are, then Odyssey would be your go-to thing. If you just want a large data set and do some quick analysis, Trinetics is just fine. But then if you get data from Trinetics, you have to either have the expertise to run the analysis yourself on your infrastructure, or rely on somebody just to help you with that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, with the research network, the TriNetX, you get location data north, south, east, west. That's it. So.
So I'm very new to this one. I have some basic experience with the kinetics, couple of analysis I have done there, which is very simple for that. The some like background information, like a knowledge, you can very quickly run that different, like what you are looking into that and control the cohort. So like beginners like me, like what the resources we have it if we go into that direction, because this seems to be like very complex approach.
Yeah, so I guess I think initially the way that we sort of want to focus in on that is, you come with the clinical questions and sort of we'll handle sort of the sort of dropping down in the terminal and writing the code. But at a high level, we will eventually expose an Atlas interface, maybe not sort of publicly, but with some Penn State authentication. And that's very analogous to TriNetX, sort of their interface. It has canned analytic pipelines, which sort of on the back end are customizable, which we can't say about TriNetX, right? That's their interface, they don't own it, but we own the Atlas, our instance of Atlas, and we can customize that anyway.
So just like again, you may get a lot of requests there, like, do you, like, I'm from the Department of Psychiatry, I want to look into something, like, I just sent the request to him and like the whole, and then do I need to, like, the funding wise, the timing wise, like, what's the, like, we are talking
So
about?
let me try to answer that, right? So I think we're just launching this at the RCPs. And I think our idea is the following, right? So I mean, at some point, maybe in the beginning, Justin or others on our staff will help with even simple things. So for example, I think Penn State has already published dozens of papers using Trinetics, and most of them are nothing more than, here's a cohort, here's some statistics on that cohort, right? Just some simple statistical analysis. That can be done using the Trinetics interface by anybody in this room. You have a question, there's a cohort, you run the stats, you have the answers. Okay, it's just a characterization of that cohort. Anybody here can do that on your own, right? Once you figure out how to use it. Beyond that, right, where extra help is needed. I mean, there are people in this room, like he's sitting over there, that know enough programming on the medical school side that can do things on their own as well. But if you need help, then you come to this. And our idea is that we will provide some basic consultation free of cost. But there has to be a path to take that somewhere. I mean, it shouldn't be just an abstract at a conference. Right. So if you have a plan for a proposal, then we will help you with that. Right? Because we have limited resources.
I have a two-part question. So from the researcher end of things, originally when you were presenting this, it sounded like there was a user interface similar to Trinetics and Odyssey, but based on the recent comments, it sounds like that's not the case. So I was hoping if you could just provide like a description on the path to be able to access the data that's from Odyssey as a researcher. And then my second part is sort of just more broadly, this consortium seems like an excellent opportunity to go and provide really meaningful clinical data and results, not only to scientists, but to clinicians who are taking care of patients, but perhaps aren't as engaged in research. So I'm curious to hear if there's any working group that's taking a look at, how do we move the information that's gained from this great database from, the scientific community to patient care.
Yes, so first part of your question, an interface does exist. It's called Atlas. And again, it is sort of the Odyssey counterpart to the Trinetics interface. As to when that would be publicly exposed.
So there are two things. Trinetics is designed for non-techie people. Atlas or Odyssey is not for non-techie. I want to clarify. Our idea behind Trinetics was to train the medical side of researchers to do the research on their own, not without any technical help. This is not for these people.
I see.
So our informatics group that is in CTSI, Justin is part of that, Daniel is here, I'm here. So we are here to help you technically. We're not exposing Atlas even for next 6 to 9 months because you would need training. It needs training way beyond Trinetics. This is not drag and drop. This is pure coding. So if you are not looking for coding, if you have no experience in coding, there's no point of learning Atlas. Reach out to us. Come with, so what our point is that you come to us with your medical question. We will get you the data. We'll get you in the next 6 months, 9 months, if you get trained on Atlas or learning about, there's a book of Odyssey also where you can learn all about how this data is curated. But till then, and even in future, as Dr. Honover said, we will participate. We are your collaborators. So we'll do the technical part. Should we expose it to the larger community? Is there any use? We will learn from in these 6 to 9 months, and then we'll see. So there's no concrete plan right now that make it public. Again, coming back, it is definitely not Trinetics.
Yeah, so to answer the second part of your question, I think Penn State, it's my opinion, we are behind on sort of going from this as a research tool to impacting clinical practice. But there are good examples of that at places like Columbia. So if there are clinicians here that are interested in pursuing that, then we should definitely get something going, right? I mean, we are sort of taking baby steps here. So there's a lot of catch up to do. There's no infrastructure, so we have that now. Maybe some pilots could be done to see when it can actually be useful in a clinical setting. So I think there are examples of Columbia. There is UCLA. There's I can name a bunch of places where the research and the clinical side are much more tightly coupled. So,
I have two questions. So I noticed on the map of where the data comes from that Africa was largely empty. And I was wondering if that has an effect, that obviously would have an effect on the data and what's being done about that. South America also looked pretty empty as well. So it seems like those are, there's a high concentration in the Eastern US and in Europe, which seems, so that seems like that data set, right? It might be 12% of the world, but it's 12% of a specific part of the world. And my other question then is, the EMR has many purposes. So is the coding and the sort of the common vocabulary and all the work that's done to create these data sets, is it all done in a way that, so I'm interested in whether or not that actually comes back and has an effect on the user, of the actual users of the EMR. Because we know that when the EMR, we know all the hype about when the EMR was implemented and how it was gonna do all this great stuff, and it does a lot of great stuff, but it also contributes to a lot of problems on the user end. And so does any of the work that's done to make the data from these electronic health records usable for research in these ways come back and affect the user?
Yeah, to the best, so let me answer the second question first. To the best of my knowledge, that's it. I don't think, so the primary focus of Odyssey has been, this data exists for whatever reason, came into existence, and let's find out whether we can use it. With all its problems, data has lots. With all its problems, can we use it to do something meaningful in terms of research? Okay. That's an interesting question. Is there a feedback loop that might impact the design of the MR?
Right, because what I see is interesting is what we're trying to do is figure out how to make the data readable by machines, right? And so we're actually now curating data, not for people, but for computational reasons. And it would be surprising to me if that did not actually come back in some way and affect the human people who use it.
Right, so.
Like eventually, right?
So, I mean, it's an interesting question, maybe a separate conversation.
Yeah.
The first one, I would bring up a very important point about, the non-uniformity of coverage, if I were to put it nicely, right? And that's for a variety of reasons. I know that leadership of Odyssey is very much aware of that, and there are some efforts. The starting point is if a place doesn't have an EMR, right? Odyssey can't help them. So they're working with the United Nations and private foundations, philanthropies, etc., to get them started, right? But it's a very long and arduous journey for that, not necessarily technical reasons, but other reasons, right? You're looking at places that have hospital infrastructure. It's nothing like a shed somewhere where somebody shows up in 2 hours a day. So that's the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's a known problem. There are sort of working groups with, some initiatives as mentioned, but it's not a.
The other thing I would mention is that if you are interested in any aspect of this, right, Odyssey is a very open community, very collaborative community, and there's a way for you to engage.
There's weekly calls, there's bi-weekly working group meetings, there's a very active forum. As mentioned, it's a very open and sort of welcoming community to engage with.
You mentioned training using Atlas. Can you be specific as to what that involves? Does that mean learning R, Python, or?
So training on Atlas would just be sort of basic functionality. No coding experience is needed for Atlas. Again, it's similar to the Trinetics interface with sort of baked in or default analysis pipelines where you would plug in, how do you build your cohort? What are the qualifying codes to define your cohort of interest? What are the sort of time intervals? If we're thinking about that patient level prediction, what's my time at risk? What's my observation window? So no coding required. It's very much sort of a web interface you fill in and then you sort of hit go and it sort of on the back end executes, builds out some scripting and executes that and sort of presents the user with results.
So is there a user manual?
Yeah, there's user manual, it's open software, there's tutorials and videos out there. Odyssey exposes like a public version of Atlas, which you can, if interested, you can.
And if there's interest in specific things, we can certainly arrange some local, things for that.
Yeah, so Atlas-demo/Odyssey is a place that you can go and play around with Atlas. It has, a simplistic fake data set that you can play around with.
There's a book of Odyssey, like if you go to Odyssey website. So the full PDF version you can download it. So this is kind of learning exercise for us also, like learning from you, what is your interest, how we train in future, Trinetics having a funded by how many $1 trillion of pharma company. This is funded by government, basically. So this interface is growing. Trinetics is very easy to use, maneuver and all that to build a cohort. This is not that easy yet. So those are the two things basically. And it might not ever become Trinetics. This is not their goal. The goal is this collaboration between various organizations, and then technical help coming from all teams.
It's also when Trinetics was launched, their primary goal was to give a cohort, essentially cohort identification. That was their initial goal. So what we are doing with Trinetics data is kind of secondary use of that data now that it exists.
We are the largest users in US of Trinetics. We are the largest publication. We have done 60 papers. Nobody has used Trinetics the way our institution has.
We've actually pushed them in ways that they didn't anticipate, right? Data requests. So.
Are there other tools like Trinetics that Penn State has access to? For instance, Palantir Foundry is one system that I'm familiar with.
So Palantir is not public. Palantir is a private company. What you're looking for is N3C, which was a national COVID collaborative, which is a NIH-funded COVID collaborative, not widely for other tests. They use Palantir. So if you want Palantir, you can buy it.
Yeah.
No, Penn State does not use Palantir. Penn State Health doesn't use, but N3C, which is a collaborative, if you're looking for COVID research, you can go there with your Penn State ID. They have all the academic hospitals, they are pushing, we are also pushing our COVID data to N3C. They're using, Foundry.
And within that community, they're exploring expanding beyond COVID or?
Yeah, it's not a public information, so they're trying to go beyond COVID. That is all depends on NIH. If they allow, only 6 hospitals are sharing certain disease-related data, which is in a pilot phase, and then it will become.
Yeah, I mean,
But again, it's a huge funding issue.
Yeah, there's, if they go kind of beyond COVID, they will be sort of in direct competition with the All of Us initiative, which NIH is funding, and so it's not clear.
Your mammography study, how come you had so few patients? There should have been, you could have had like hundreds of thousands, right?
Yes, so this was the protocol not developed by me. Like I said, I ran in our data last night. I didn't get a sort of critical look of sort of how many patients were qualified or not. I think sort of looking at the initial outcome qualification, there were thousands of patients, but some dropped out because they didn't have like the required amount of follow-up time or the prior 3-year history. I think that killed a lot of the cohort population as well. Yeah. Yes.
It's more of a data nerd modeling question, not operational, but is there ever, the map kind of made me think of it, is there ever concern with like, independence of data points when you have the same patient in multiple EHR systems and they're all collaborating, or is the data set kind of big enough that that's a wash?
That's an open question as far as that's something that could be studied separately. As a statistician, you could study that, or if there is a problem, right? We didn't get into all of the potential problems and all the sources of bias in the but that's one.
There's no like distant merging possibility, right? Because it's all de-identified.
Yeah, if I go to Mount Nittany or Hershey or UPMC and they all push data to Odyssey or TriNetX, right? And within that, I'm 3 independent people with no merging. Yeah, that's something that I've thought about. And
I think that how severe is that problem sort of depends on how much mobility patients have. And that may depend on maybe more so in certain areas.
And you can play the game with, requiring longer prior continuous sort of enrollment sort of thing. find certain medical events to be in that history to say, okay, well, in some reasonable approximation, this patient has sort of, we've, sufficient enough data